What happens when Karen from the HOA drills into your land without permission? Chaos. Watch as a simple water project turns into a neighborhood disaster when a pipeline explosion destroys everything. You won't believe what happens next. The HOA, or Homeowners Association, was a governing body that had control over various aspects of the community. But its influence was starting to grow in ways that felt increasingly intrusive. The residents had always been aware of the HOA's role in maintaining common areas, enforcing community rules, and organizing events, but they had never imagined the kind of power it could wield over their personal land. Karen, a long-standing board member with a reputation for being overly assertive, had been pushing for a new community water project. Her plan was to drill for water on private properties to supply the whole neighborhood, and she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Karen's proposal was presented as a benefit to everyone, a solution to the community's water supply issues, which had been a growing concern. However, what she didn't tell the residents was that the project would involve drilling on private land without their consent. As Karen's idea gained traction, she used her position on the board to rally support, convincing the HOA and the other members that it was necessary for the greater good. There was little room for dissent, and the sense of urgency surrounding the project made it feel like no one could say no. The residents began to feel a sense of unease as Karen's influence grew. While the board members argued that the water shortage was a critical issue, they failed to address the underlying problem. Karen had never bothered to ask the landowners if they were okay with having drilling equipment on their properties. The lack of transparency and the aggressive push to move forward left the community divided. Those who questioned the project were labeled as troublemakers or accused of not caring about the well-being of the community. As the days passed, the drilling project moved closer to reality, and the user began to realize the true extent of Karen's power. They felt their land, which had been a sanctuary of peace, was about to be invaded. The feeling of helplessness began to set in, and the sense that the HOA, with Karen at its helm, could overstep its bounds with no regard for individual rights became all too clear. It was not just a water project. It was a test of authority, and Karen was determined to pass at any cost. As the drilling project moved forward, the community was forced to accept that it was no longer a matter of discussion or negotiation. It was happening. The heavy machinery arrived, rolling onto the user's land like an unstoppable force. The user watched, powerless, as the drilling crews set up their equipment right on the edge of their property. The HOA's announcement had been swift, and the board members had pushed it through with little to no regard for the concerns of the landowners. The lack of transparency in the whole process became painfully obvious, and the user began to realize just how little control they had over their own land. At first, it seemed like the project might be a simple inconvenience, just a few machines, a few days of noise, and it would be over. But as the drilling started, it quickly became clear that this was much more than an intrusion. It was a disruption of everything the user valued about their home. The sound of drills and the constant hum of machinery filled the air, replacing the quiet peace that once defined their property. The crew, led by Karen's direct orders, was determined to get the job done, regardless of the toll it was taking on the residents. Neighbors began to speak out, but Karen and the other board members dismissed their concerns. It asked for the greater good. They were told, "We need this water for the whole community." But to the user and others, it felt more like an imposition, one that had been made without proper consent or regard for individual rights. The user was left feeling isolated, as if their property was no longer their own. The HOA had taken control, and Karen's relentless push for the project made it feel like resistance was futile. As the days passed, the drilling continued, and the unease among the residents grew. The user, who had always taken pride in their property, now watched as it was transformed into a construction zone. The land, once a symbol of personal freedom and space, was now a battleground for control. Despite the mounting tension, Karen remained unfazed, convinced that she was doing what was necessary for the community. But for the user and others who were affected, it was clear that this was not about helping the community. It was about Karen asserting her power, and the residents were left to bear the consequences. The worst-case scenario that everyone had been dreading finally came to pass. One afternoon, as the drilling crew worked tirelessly, a sudden loud, ear-splitting noise pierced through the air, a screeching, grinding sound followed by a thunderous explosion. The ground shook, and the air was filled with dust and debris. The drill had struck something it shouldn't have, an underground pipeline. In an instant, chaos erupted. The crew scrambled, panicked, as water and gas gushed uncontrollably from the ruptured pipe, causing an immediate hazard to everyone in the vicinity. The blast sent a plume of smoke into the sky, and the damage was so severe that the nearby homes started to shake. The user, along with their neighbors, stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The once peaceful neighborhood was now a scene of utter devastation. The drilling site was now an active danger zone, and the community was left to deal with the aftermath. The HOA had promised that everything was under control, but it was clear that the board had overlooked the most basic safety checks in their rush to drill. As the fire and rescue teams arrived on the scene, they worked frantically to contain the damage, but the situation was already spiraling out of control. The pipeline rupture had not only caused a massive environmental hazard, but also put the entire community at risk. The smell of gas and the threat of further explosions hung in the air. What had started as a simple water project was now a full-blown disaster. And Karen, who had pushed for the drilling, was nowhere to be found. The board members who had supported the project were quick to deflect blame. Karen, as the mastermind behind the plan, remained eerily calm, attempting to minimize the severity of the situation. But it was clear to the community that her reckless decisions had led to this catastrophe. The user and their neighbors were left to pick up the pieces. Property damage, safety concerns, and environmental hazards were now their responsibility, and the HOA was nowhere to offer help. The realization dawned. Karen had not only jeopardized their homes but had placed the entire community in harm's way, all for the sake of her personal agenda. The aftermath of the explosion was nothing short of catastrophic, and the fallout was immediate. The once thriving community was now a shadow of its former self, with residents left reeling from the damage. The destruction caused by the ruptured pipeline was immense. Homes were shaken, fences were knocked down, and the landscape itself was scarred. The environmental damage was equally severe, as the leak from the pipeline posed a major risk to the surrounding area's soil and water supply. Yet, the worst part wasn't just the physical devastation, it was the utter lack of accountability from the HOA and, more specifically, from Karen. As the dust settled and the emergency teams worked to contain the situation, the community's anger began to boil over. Residents demanded answers, but Karen remained calm and detached, as if the explosion were just a minor inconvenience rather than the disaster it was. She downplayed the severity of the incident and insisted that everything was under control. Her response was dismissive, as though the damage didn't matter to her as long as the project had moved forward. The other board members, who had once supported Karen's idea, quickly began to backtrack, distancing themselves from the chaos. They tried to deflect blame, claiming that the explosion was an unforeseen accident and that no one could have predicted the outcome. But the residents weren't buying it. The user and their neighbors began to organize, demanding a full investigation into the cause of the explosion and the role the HOA had played in the disaster. The lack of transparency from the HOA made it clear that the board had not properly vetted the drilling process, nor had they ensured the necessary safety precautions were in place. What was supposed to be a well-intentioned community project had turned into a reckless gamble, and now the people were left to pick up the pieces. Local authorities were brought in to investigate, but it quickly became apparent that Karen's influence over the HOA had shielded her from any real consequences. The board's focus shifted from accountability to damage control. They attempted to sweep the issue under the rug, hoping that the community would move on quickly. But the residents were determined to ensure that this would not be forgotten. The HOA had pushed their agenda without regard for the risks involved, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. The fallout from the explosion had only just begun, and the battle for justice was far from over. As the dust began to settle and the full scope of the disaster came into view, the community's resolve only grew stronger. The user, along with several other residents, decided that the only way forward was to ensure that Karen and the HOA were held fully accountable for the damage they had caused. The explosion and the subsequent destruction had left deep scars on the neighborhood, both physically and emotionally. While Karen had attempted to downplay the event, claiming it was a mere accident, the community was not willing to let it slide. The residents, united by their shared sense of injustice, set out to take action. The user, along with a group of concerned neighbors, started gathering evidence, documenting the damage, and speaking with experts about the long-term environmental effects of the pipeline rupture. They reached out to local authorities and started an online petition to bring attention to the incident. Word spread quickly, and soon the neighborhood was rallying around the cause. Karen, once a powerful figure in the community, began to feel the weight of the mounting pressure. Her attempts to cover up the incident only fueled the fire, and the HOA's failure to address the situation directly made them look even more negligent. The user and their group of allies knew that the battle would not be easy. They were up against a powerful HOA and a woman who had spent years solidifying her influence over the community. But the desire for justice pushed them forward. They began to meet with lawyers, looking for ways to hold Karen and the HOA accountable for the damages caused by the explosion. The legal route was complicated, but they were determined to see it through. As the legal battles unfolded, the HOA's reputation took a hit. The community's trust in the board, and in Karen herself, was shattered. Residents began to demand changes, calling for a complete overhaul of the HOA's leadership. Karen's once solid position on the board began to waver as her support eroded. In the end, the community's collective action forced the HOA to act, and Karen was removed from her position, no longer able to impose her will on the neighborhood. The legal action led to settlements for the damaged properties, and the community was finally able to rebuild, both physically and emotionally. But the fight for justice wasn't just about repairing broken homes, it was about reclaiming the community's voice, ensuring that such an incident would never happen again. The explosion that had once seemed like an insurmountable disaster had ultimately led to the downfall of the woman who had caused it, and a renewed sense of unity among the residents. If you want to see how this story unfolds and stay updated on more shocking HOA drama, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this wild journey.